Time for another board game review, and this time we have the game Imperium Legends. This was sent to me by Osprey Games, and it's designed by Nigel Buckle and David Trixie. In your hands lies the destiny of one of history's great civilizations. Under constant threat of attack, you must conquer new lands, oversee dramatic scientific and cultural advances, and lead your people into the era of empire. Expand too rapidly, and unrest will bring your civilization to its knees. Build up too slowly, however, and you might find yourself a mere footnote of history. As one of 8 radically asymmetrical civilizations, you will compete to become the most dominant empire the world has ever seen. Let me show you how to play. So the game is played in a series of rounds. Each round starts with a player to the left of the Solstice card. This thing, although in a 2-player game, which I recommend you play this 2-player, don't worry about it. Play continues until either scoring or collapse is triggered, which ends the game. On each turn, you will activate, or innovate, or revolt. Once you finish doing one of those, you clean up. After that, the player to your left takes their turn. If the Solstice card is between you and the player to your left, meaning after basically you and your other player do a turn, you do a Solstice keyword. I'll get into that later. When you activate, you can take actions and use exhaust abilities in any order and in any combination. So, to take an action, you take one of these tokens from your state card. If you have no actions left on here, you can't do an action. Then you can play a card from your hand to your play area, like Western Jowl. And this one has an infinity symbol on it, meaning it stays on the board. When you play this card, you gain 1 material. Materials are used to purchase certain cards, and you may garrison a card. So this game is filled with lots of keywords. I'm not going to go through every single keyword. When you play the game for the first time, there is unfortunately going to be a lot of like, all right, when you play a card, you look at exactly what it does. Garrisoning, for example, is you take another card from your hand and place it face up underneath this card. So I could be like, okay, I'm gonna garrison this card underneath here, like so. If anything happens to this card, it also happens to this card. But otherwise, this card is basically not considered to be in play, but it is out of your hand and deck, which can be useful. Some cards have a barbarian symbol. That means you can only play if you are currently a barbarian state. When you flip over to an empire, you can no longer play these cards, but cards with the empire symbol, you can then play. And then exhausting, what you could do, let's say play Mandate of Heaven, which uses an action. Exhaust, add 1 population token from the supply to a card in the market, then you may abandon this card. On the Solstice, you discard 2 cards. So I can play this with an action. If I wanted, I could exhaust it, which would let me add a population token to one of the cards in the market. We'll get into the market later. And then if I wanted, I could abandon this card. Abandon just means discard it. If a card already has an exhaust token on it, you cannot use it again that turn. Now, besides using your turn to activate, you could instead innovate. So first, you would take all the cards in your hand and just discard them. Then you would break through. Let's describe what break through means. If you break through, you have some options. If a card tells you to break through for a certain suit, you have to do that suit. Otherwise, option 1, select any card of that suit from the market and add it to your hand. If there are tokens on it, like as you can see, this one is a token, this one is a token, you gain those tokens as well. If there is an unrest card underneath that card, you also get that card. Let's say I take this card. I would get the token, and I would get the Elders and Unrest card. These cards go straight to my hand. Then, you would reveal a card from the appropriate deck, and depending on the type of card it is, you put an Unrest card underneath it. These Unrest cards suck. You can choose on your turn to pay stuff to get rid of them and return them to the Unrest pile, because they're -2 points at the end of the game. And also, if too many of these get drawn, you could potentially lose the entire game. You can also, instead of taking one of the cards face up, you could break through from a specific deck. In that case, you just take the top card, let's say of the green deck, the Uncivilized deck, and just put it in your hand. Then you don't have to take an Unrest card. If you break through for a blue card or for a suit where the appropriate deck is empty, you'll reveal cards 1 by 1 from this main deck until you find a card of your declared suit and then you shuffle everything else back in. If you can't find one in here, then you get 2 of these progress tokens, which are also used to spend on things. The final action you can do is Revolt. So if you have a bunch of these unrest cards in your hand, you could spend your turn returning them to the unrest pile, because they're bad. However, then you can't take any actions or use exhaust abilities. Same thing with it innovating. If you do that, you can't take actions. In the cleanup phase, once you've done your action, or once you've done your thing, there's cleanup phase. You add a progress token to a card in the market. Then you remove all tokens, exhaust tokens and action tokens, and return them to your state card. Then you can discard as many cards as you want to your discard pile, and then you just draw up to 5. Now, if you ever get to the point where you run out of cards in your draw deck and you need to draw a card, you check your state card. If your state card shows Barbarian side, and if there are no X tokens on your nation deck is up here, you can place the top card of the nation deck into your discard pile. Now it's part of your deck. Then you put an exhaust token on top of it. If there was one already here, you can't do it again until it resets. If you get through your nation deck and you place this circle card into your deck, then your state card flips to its empire side. You would then shuffle your discard pile into a new deck and draw. If your state card is an empire, if there are no exhaust tokens in your development area and you have one or more on your card, you may pay the development cost shown on one of your development cards to develop it. So, looking here, this one would cost 7 materials to build. If I had 7 materials and an exhaust token, I could spend those materials and then take this card and put it in my discard pile. Then you move an exhaust token onto here. These exhaust tokens, placing them on the development deck or the nation deck, prevent you from like breaking the game. Like, oh well, I get to do it again and again and again. There's only once before your refresh can you do it. Because if there was already one here, because you already did this and you triggered, going through your deck again, you don't get to do it again. Now I mentioned Solstice. Once a round of players' turns happens, everyone activates the Solstice keywords. Like this guy, you have to discard 2 cards, and so on. Then once that happens, you just go back to regular turns. Now, the game ends in a couple ways. Scoring or collapse. Scoring is triggered if you run out of cards in the main deck, if a player develops all the cards in their development area, thus becoming a full empire, if the King of Kings cards is flipped face down, that's this deck here. And there's also special victories for certain players, like the Viking player, the Arthurian player, the Utopian player. They have different victory conditions. If the end of game is triggered by scoring, you complete the current round and do one final round, and you add up your victory points. If you look at these, they all have different values. Like this one's 3 victory points. This one is 1 victory point for every 4 yellow cards you have, and you add them all up. Also, you get a victory point for each one of your progress tokens. Then you would score for all your cards. There is a limit on these variable cards. You can never score more than 10 points from a single card. So even if I had a ton of yellow cards, the most I can get is 10 points. And then the most victory points wins. If there's a tie, you share the victory. Boo. If collapse is triggered, where you run out of cards in this unrest pile, the game ends immediately. You count the number of unrest cards in your hand, play area, basically everywhere, and whoever has the fewest cards wins. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. If you take too many unrest cards without returning them, there's a good chance you will just lose. And that's the basic gist of the game. You're trying to develop your empire by going through your deck, getting cards, trying not to crumble by unrest. There are a lot of keywords I didn't go through. I can show you some examples of some of the cards, though, just to give you a sense. Archipelago. You may put a card from your discard pile into your history. Exile a card from the market. You may garrison a card. So your history, for some nations have a history, they go out of play underneath your power card. But they, however, still score at the end of the game. Exiling a card is you can take any card from the market and return any unrest cards under it to the pile. Then you basically replace it. You take the other card and it's out of the game into an exile pile. You may never exile a card with one or more tokens on it unless you are swapping it, which is a different thing. And there are some cards that even let you acquire or break through from the exile pile, so they're not gone forever. But as you can see, just from one card, there can be a lot of keywords that you kind of have to learn on the fly. Once you learn them all, the game's a little smoother, but it can be a little tough in the beginning when you're just kind of going through it. Domestication, when you exhaust this, when you gain materials from that card in play, exhaust this card to gain 1 progress. Corruption, all players gain 2 materials. Each other player takes an unrest, you gain a progress. Scythians, exhaust this when another player plays an attack card. Those are cards that can attack you, obviously. You may exhaust this card to avoid its effects. Macedonians, acquire yellow twice, including from exiled cards, and put this card into your history. I'm not even gonna go through all the different, there's like 8 different, civilizations. They all play pretty differently. An example of one would be the Qin, if that's how you pronounce it. They have a power like passive. When you would place the progress on a card in the market, instead place 1 population. Exhaust, if you gain a card from the market with population on it, double the population gained. They also have bonus 1 point for every recurring card in play, excluding yellow ones. They also have different powers on the back. You can choose an A power or a B power. But yeah, there's different ones. There's in this set, Arthurians, Atlanteans, Egyptians, Mauryaans, Minoans, Olmecs, Qin, and Utopians. They all have different difficulty ratings, different setups, different strategies, and different exceptions and things. Like, for example, like the Atlanteans, they don't have a history. You start as an empire, so you don't have to worry about the barbarian phase. They all have different little twists and perks like that. But otherwise, that's the game. You just race to develop your empire while avoiding unrest. So this is a really solid deck building game. It makes you think. It has very clever mechanics, and even though I love deck building games that do encourage you to just get tons of cards, this one makes you carefully consider exactly which cards you should go for. I'm also impressed that this features asymmetric civilizations that all play pretty differently, but it's not too hard to grasp them once you know the basic rules of the game. I think one of the biggest hurdles is setup. It can frankly be a bit cumbersome, especially when you first play. It also doesn't help that some civilizations have some cards that you do add and some you don't. So you're doing a lot of, okay, this goes in this pile, this one goes on top of this, but this one, but I'm not this civilization, so this doesn't happen. It also doesn't help that the rulebook reads like it was written by a computer pretending to be a human. It's not a good rulebook. Once you start playing, though, it's not so bad, although it's one of those games where it has a whole glossary of keywords in the back. Some people hate that. I actually like it because it kind of gets you to start playing right away and you just learn the keywords you need to learn as you go. But it is overwhelming for some people, so just keep that in mind. But again, once you start getting the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward. Use your actions to play cards and exhaust abilities to trigger them. One thing I really like is that a lot of cards, when you get them, they force you to take unrest cards. So like I mentioned before, you can't just buy cards willy-nilly. You have to think, do I really want this card? Because I got to take this unrest card, and that could potentially lead me closer to collapse. It's a very delicate balancing act of making sure you flesh out those cards with revolts before getting more. Breaking through is a nice way of negating that effect, but then you're stuck with random draw, which can be interesting. A nice touch is that in a lot of cases when you gain cards, it goes straight into your hand. So they can become useful instantly instead of having to wait, which is a very satisfying mechanic. The most satisfying and interesting mechanic this game has is the whole developing your civilization by going through the deck. Yeah, through the deck. Once you empty your deck, you can start adding those cool cards. It's elegantly limited, so you can't just break the game because you have to put those exhaust tokens on them once you do it, and that won't reset until your next turn or whatever, or whenever it happens. But I love that feeling of slowly adding these better cards to your deck, and then you become an empire and you start developing even better cards. It's really, really satisfying. What's also impressive is it feels very thematic. you really do feel like your empire is getting better technology and developing. Other than that, some of the keywords are a little fiddly, like the whole Solstice thing. Like, I would only play this with 2 players. I think it'd be absurdly long with beyond 2. With Solstice, there's this whole like, oh, okay, well, we gotta do Solstice again because I did a turn, you did a turn. Okay, that's the round. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it just felt a little fiddly. And some little mechanics here and there and keywords can feel a little fiddly. Overall, though, this is a really solid deck builder. Once you get a grasp on all the keywords, it's rewarding, it's strategic. I definitely recommend this one. Also, it combines with the other, I don't have the other set of classics, which is cool. Haven't played it, but it's cool that you combine them and get like 16 civilizations to play with. So yeah, I think this one's great.